discovering the man known as the Dr. Poet, up next on Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Krystal Acosta. The poem springs from the half-spoken words of such patients as a physician sees from day to day. Words once written by a local Rutherford doctor who was also an innovator in American poetry, Dr. William Carlos Williams. The poetry of Williams is hard to separate from his work as a doctor. Williams often wrote on the back of prescription pads while tending to patients, a clear representation of the degree to which his clinical practice and artistry were intertwined. This past summer, I had the chance to attend a wonderful event at the Meadowlands Museum that honored the life of the Dr. Poet and the babies he helped deliver along the way. Let's take a look.
So today's event came to be through our exhibit, actually. So we wanted to do an exhibit on medical history, and we had two parts. We had Dr. Williams, and then we also had the Becton Dickinson side.
Since he was a pediatrician, we figured that people that were delivered by him would probably still be around. Wouldn't it be cool to have people that were delivered by him who are part of living history come back and have a little reunion, and we, give them a little souvenir and a memento of the occasion. That's how the idea came to be.
All these medical information you find behind me is actually from my home that I had stored for many, many years. I wanted to exhibit it and show, his history. And I think the whole idea behind this was to show him as a man rather than just as a poet. But people don't realize he also was a doctor. And I think the idea was to show him as the man and the doctor from Bergen County, southern Bergen County, who he was.
I got a lot of calls saying, I'm a William Carlos Williams baby, and we're so excited to be part of this. And just getting everybody's birth certificates together was a big challenge, but I think everybody was just really excited to share and to be honored in this special way, because usually you don't get to be honored by the doctor that you were delivered by. So everybody was really, really thrilled to be a part of it, and I got a great response.
My mother, she had a book of poetry by him, and she showed it to me. And she told me that he was the doctor that delivered me. That's how I found out.
I was delivered by Dr. Williams at St. Mary's Hospital. And he's always been an inspiration to me.
Joining me now is Dr. Neil Baldwin, an acclaimed cultural historian, literary critic, biographer, and a professor with the theater and dance department here at Montclair State. His biography, To All Gentleness, William Carlos Williams, the Dr. Poet, chronicles the life of the New Jersey native who wrote poetry with a doctor's eye and practiced medicine with the compassion of a poet. Welcome, Neil.
Hi, nice to be here.
So, Neil, I got to attend this wonderful event over the summer. And as an audience member, I felt such a connection with all the individuals who were delivered by William Carlos Williams. And because they had such a connection with him, even though some of them didn't even know they were delivered by the poet. And they were just so intrigued by his whole life story. And I felt that same connection when I read your book.
Oh, thank you.
And I just wanted to tell you, it's a great book, great read, and you say the whole book in third person, but you start and end with a first-person experience. Tell me, what was your first encounter with his work, and how did it all begin?
It all began when I was in high school, believe it or not. We went to the same high school, Horace Mann, many, many years apart from each other, obviously. And I remember there was this exhibit case outside the library in the school, and it had books by famous alumni in there, and I saw his name and the book of collected poems, and I saw that he was a doctor. That actually caught my eye. It just seemed unusual to me. Like my first thought was, how did he find the time? I remember thinking that when I was 18 years old. That was the first thought that came through my head, and that stuck with me all the way through. And I ended up writing my dissertation on him and writing the book. I mean, fast forward many years.
In high school, he suffered a heart strain that prevented him. He was involved in sports that prevented him, and he went to this depressed mode. And that's where his first piece of work came out. It was called, he wrote, "A black, black cloud flew over the sun, driven by fierce flying rain." What did you take from his first piece of work?
Well, I think that I remember when I discovered that, and I thought to myself, here's a person who was really in touch with his feelings. And that also struck me as interesting in terms of being a doctor, having to be, if you're a medical doctor, you have to have a certain affinity with your patients, but you also have to be able to step back and analyze what's wrong with them. And that's very much what poets have to do with their experience with the world.
What would you say that, from his first piece of work, how did it differ from stuff he created later on?
Well, he started out being a very romantic poet, by which I mean Keats was his favorite, John Keats, who was an English poet, and he was into rhyme and meter and very formal structure, kind of Robert Browning, Keats, all that kind of thing. Wordsworth was another favorite. Shakespeare he loved. And then as time went on, he developed a more modernistic, abstract, non-rhyming type of poetry.
It's incredible because throughout the book, you can see this internal struggle that he had between being a poet and being a doctor. It was always conflict. He always felt it was a conflict. He had to be one or the other, but he was both. And that's the impression that I got from your words. And I want to read something that you wrote, a small passage. Like the doctor, the poet developed his senses above those of most people, so he could see, feel, and touch what other men took for granted, as signs of illness, signs of life within himself or within a woman coming to term. Like the doctor, the poet needed to develop a skill at active waiting. He had to know when to act, when to wait, and to move quickly when the right moment arrived. For labor with babies and with poems was long and delivery speedy. The struggle to bring forth life could take many, many hours, sometimes days, but the moment of truth for newborns and new poems alike was brief. Like the doctor, the poet cared, despite his grumblings and complaints, and he still had to dig deeply and find enough caring left over after a day delivering babies to write. Like the doctor, the poet learned to live with constant tiredness. Then the words came. I absolutely love that passage because for me, this was about early on in the book that you wrote that, but that passage for me summed up his entire struggle. He always compared life as a doctor to life as a poet. And like I said, he had the compassion of a poet when he addressed his patients. He was a pediatrics doctor, so he dealt with children and he dealt with delivering babies, but he also, as a doctor, as a poet, he used all the instruments he learned and wrote his poetry. How did you find those words to sum that up?
I was thinking while you were reading it, I think number one is because I started out as a poet myself when I was in college and then in graduate school. I did a lot of poetry of my own, but also translating from other languages. And I published a literary magazine of poetry, and I taught poetry. And I think my familiarity with the process and the birth of something artistically in all the arts, now that I've become more involved in other arts, the birth of something artistically is very similar to, and I've had children since then, I've had grandchildren since then, so I really think I understand the gestation and the waiting, and then the thing happens, and then you love what happens, and then you have to watch it mature and grow. It's very similar. They're very similar processes. I see it now. I didn't even see it when I started poetry. I didn't have kids or a family or anything. And now looking back, I see what the relationship is.
Do you think that he saw it when he was writing these poems? Because I felt like he had such a conflict. He felt he wanted to be a poet, but he felt he had to be a doctor to have a livelihood.
Well, I think you're right about the conflict. The conflict, and as a writer myself and as a biographer, you know, conflict is very important in art making, of all arts. You have to have a struggle. You have to have unrest. You have to have a sense of incompletion. He toggled back and forth, but I think the fact is that having been constrained to do this writing, like between patients, he had a desk that had a typewriter inside. I hope everybody knows what a typewriter is. Anyway, and he would flip it up, and the typewriter would be there, and then the next patient would come in, he would flip it down so you wouldn't even see it. And then, as you mentioned, he wrote on prescription pads at a red light or waiting for it in the delivery room or in the waiting room. He would jot little passages on the prescription pads, which I believe is why the poems are so compact and short, because they started out on prescription pads.
Tell me how you were able to write this biography in so detail, because for me, you wrote it in a third person, but it was as if you were there. Just down to the details of him riding in the car at a red light.
Well, I was there in the sense that my project in grad school, just very quickly, was where I went to University of Buffalo. They had the entire William Carlos Williams archive, all of his papers, all of his manuscripts, all of his stuff that he saved from all the poems and books and novels and epic poetry and essays and short stories that he wrote in his entire life, which is 20,000 manuscripts. And it had sat there since the 50s. And no one had the time or the money to catalog it and put it all together and put it in order. So for my doctoral dissertation, it was to write a catalog of all of that stuff. So it took me 4 years, but I was only being paid $65 a week as a grad student back then. So they got a good deal. And I did it, and that's how I found out his method and everything like that, because I had to line up all the papers and put them in order of which draft came first, etc.
And it's crazy because you could see in your words, he found inspiration for poems in pretty much everything. Mm-hmm. That's why he always had the prescription pad in his pocket. He would overhear a conversation with his patients and would jot down a few words, and then later the poem would come to him at night. And you also write, I believe he said this, but I could be wrong. No one believes that poetry can exist in his own life. This is just to say, but everything in our lives, if it is sufficiently authentic to our lives and touches us deeply enough with a certain amount of feeling, is capable of being organized into a form which can be a poem. I love that. I think was that from him, or was that your own words?
I think it was from him, but it's also from me. Because, you see, this is the inspiration that he was my first inspiration to continue. I've written many books since then. This was my first book. I've written many, many books since then. And I see why I was inspired by him now, because you have to find the will within yourself. And he was my role model, because I thought, well, if a pediatrician and everybody, you know how busy, and back in those days they made house calls and delivered babies in people's houses. And if kids were sick and the mother couldn't leave the house, he would drive around, cut home at 3 or 4 in the morning. The pounding on the typewriter would be so loud. His son told me it shook the house. It woke up his own kids. So I feel like there's no excuse. If you want to be committed to an art, then you have 2 choices. You either do it or you don't. You find the time. And I feel like he taught me that, and he inspired me.
Another thing that I found that I was so intrigued by was that the fact during his time there was war going on.
Oh, and, yeah, 2 wars, 3 wars.
Yeah, because he had World War I, World War II. Korea.
His son was in Korea.
And it was crazy because so many of his friends, his co-workers in the arts, left America. They went overseas. Ezra Pound was one of his close college chums who went overseas, and they went for adventure and for inspiration. But he always wanted to be home in America. He had this...
In New Jersey, let's get that, because this is Carpe Diem and we're in Montclair State.
In New Jersey.
Like 5, you know, I don't know, what is Rutherford, like 8 or 9 miles from here, maybe?
Yeah, I'm not even a 10-minute drive.
Okay, so let's just realize this. He was like right in this one house, in the town where he was born. So the question I guess you're asking me is, why is this?
Yeah,
Because
why didn't he jump ship like everyone else?
Because this is another thing that I think is very inspiring for somebody. Like, I'm not from New Jersey, but my family, we moved out here about 25 years ago, and you start to appreciate, he used to say, the local is the only universal, which was a big thing with him. Like, and as you said before, you can write a poem about the littlest detail right under your nose, and you can be on your walk around the block like I do with the dog and see something that interests you. You do not have to go, your imagination can take you to places far, far away, farther away than Paris and London and where all the other lost generation pals of his went. And he believed that he could focus in and make a huge corpus of work out of it, and he did it. He wrote an epic poem on Patterson, which is, you know, Patterson up the road here. He wrote a whole book-length poem on Patterson itself.
That's funny that you mentioned Patterson, because my next question
how
is,
convenient.
so the whole book you write it in third person, but for
Yeah.
some reason in the chapter that you discuss Patterson, you jump out of the third person and you go into your first person. So you talk about him discovering Patterson and where he gets his inspiration, because he was looking for something fresh and he didn't want to write about Rutherford. So he found Patterson. He focused on Patterson and the industrial, how it was changing. And for the first time, and this is about more than halfway into the book, you jump out of the third person perspective and put in your own first person perspective.
I've done this in all my books. I guess it was an early editor I had who told me that I need to, when you're writing a biography, you have to step back. You cannot become too deeply involved in your subject, because then your reader will feel like you're telling them something that they aren't able to draw their own conclusions from the facts. On the other hand, you have to show yourself at some point. Like, you're a student of the human condition. You have to show yourself. So every one of my books, at some point I go in or go to a place where the person lived. Or like when I wrote about Mexico, I went and traveled around a lot and wrote about the various mythological figures and such and such. Man Ray, I went to Paris and walked around there. And Edison, you know, even though it was New Jersey, he worked in London, I went over there. But you have to put yourself into the story at some point to remind people that you're a human being and you're writing about a human being. And it brings the reader in, and then you step back and you portray, like you say, the third person.
Why did you choose at that point in the book to do that jump
Because
in?
Patterson, what I did was I went up to Garrett Mountain Park, because he has a whole passage in the book, book 3 of Patterson, which all takes place in Garrett Mountain Park, you know, where the castle is. You can see Patterson, the city, from the hill up there. And so I thought, I want to walk where he walked, and I want to see what he saw, and I want to bring the story into the direct eyes of the reader. And I felt like that was a good place to do it, because I came out from the city, which is where I was living at the time, and sort of like did the reverse trip from what he did, and it worked. I did it because I thought it was an artistic thing to do.
I thought I was so intrigued by it, because I was so used to reading third person. All of a sudden, I read it, and then I had to go back and reread it, because I was like, oh, okay.
But see, it made you pay attention, and you remembered it, so obviously it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, no, it definitely worked, and it broke the story up in such a good way, because then it brings you back kind of to reality, and because you're reading the story of this man, but then kind of brings you back almost to present day, and you realize, you know, this he's writing about something that's really there.
I mean, you can go up there right after this. You know, you could go up there right now and find those places and stand in those places.
Yeah,
That's right.
because
You
you
can just get
mentioned
in
the
car.
falls and all that.
Just right up the road here, up Valley Road.
And another thing that he besides home and everything, he loved nature. And you write, two forces in William Carlos Williams kept him going when all else failed: his love of nature and his faith in friendship. And throughout reading the book, it's true. He had, whenever he couldn't find inspiration, he would always think back about how he wanted to be a forester.
Oh, yeah.
And how that was his dream as a child. And then he always talked about friends and acquaintances, and he loved to meet fresh, new college students who would reach out to him.
And babies.
And he just had a love, I feel like, for life.
Yes, I think, though, you're making a very good point about nature, because nature is one of the most romantic, in the sense of romantic poetry, which I talked about earlier. Nature is one of the central themes in poetry overall, I think, because it starts out with people looking at the world around them and writing about what they see and what they feel about what they see. And he started out as a child. It was all forests and swamps, like around Rutherford. Some of it's still there, but most of it isn't. And right behind him was a farm, and he used to go in there with his brother and run around and play. And he used to collect leaves and bring them home, and they're like little samples of things he found in the forest and stuff like that. He was very into being outside. Well, that's what kids used to do back in those days, be outside playing.
And as his life progressed, eventually he passed on his medical practice to his son, and he started to get ill himself. And his poetry, I felt, changed at that point. He was remorseful, especially towards his wife, and he wrote a lot of poetry towards her. What can you say about their connection and their bond? Because they were married for, I believe, over 50 years.
Yes, well, he was a womanizer, and he had affairs, and he had a wandering eye. But he also, and this goes back to your conflict, he also said, and I quote, "In one woman I find all the rest." That was kind of like that's a line from his poetry, but he had a way of rationalizing having all these other women and having his own wife at the same time for like 55 or 60 years or whatever. And what you're talking about is he had somewhat of a nervous breakdown, a stroke and a / nervous breakdown, and the therapist told him to write letters to his wife in the house to help rehabilitate, like rehab for his mind. And I saw the letters, so in the archives. They were restricted, but I saw them. He would write to her every day and apologize and tell her he loved her, and then he wrote this long poem all about his, as you say, his remorse, and asked for her forgiveness. And so yeah, he went into a kind of a reflective, internalizing guilt trip, aging period, but that's part of life.
Now, reflecting back on all the works that you've read of his, I'm sure...
You mean everything?
Everything.
Yeah.
Is there one piece that will always hold a special place in your heart that you would say is your absolute favorite?
Actually, there is. There's a poem, it's in the book, Patterson, book 3. It's a separate poem that he put into the book, but it actually exists on its own. It's called The Descent, and was written in the late 40s, just about the period we're talking about here with the stroke and some of the problems that started to arise. He was in his 60s at the time. And at one point he says, memory is a kind of accomplishment, a sort of renewal, even an initiation. And I feel like even when he was going through his bad period, he knew that he still had the resources within himself to persevere. And that now at this point in my life, that also is very inspiring, to know that he wrote a poem about the first astronaut, Yuri Gagarin, the Russian astronaut, Sputnik, and he wrote something like, heel and toe to the end. Heel and toe to the end. Like, just keep at it until you can't get up and do it anymore, and that's a big inspiration.
Now, where did your inspiration come for the title, To All Gentleness?
Oh, well, that came from a poem that he wrote. But the poem is about roses in the rain and being with raindrops on them, and they're bending over slightly. And he perceived this, and it's called To All Gentleness. But I also thought it could be interpreted as him being gentle to all people, like you said. So I took that from him.
Well, Neil, this is a wonderful book, and we're coming close to the end, but what's next? What are you working on?
What's next?
Yeah, what's your next book?
Okay, well, right now I'm writing a biography of Martha Graham. Martha Graham, who I consider to be the inventor of modern dance in America. And she lived a very long, complex life. She died in 1991 at the age of 97. She created the first modern dance company in this country, which is celebrating its 90th birthday in the spring. And I'm writing this book on Martha Graham's career. It's called When Dance Became Modern. And it's the story of how she became Martha Graham. It's not a complete book of her whole life. It ends when she became famous, and how did modern dance come out of that.
And what inspired you to take on this challenge?
What inspired me was coming to teach here at Montclair State, and Laurie Catter-Henry, who's the chairman of the dance department, knocked on my door one day about 8 years ago and asked me if I would like to come and sit in on some rehearsals and start to help the dancers write about what they do, because I work a lot with the theater students and help them with writing. And that changed my life, because Martha Graham Company was here, and I sat in on that, and I realized I had missed out on her, because she's a key link in everything. So that's how it started, from working here at Montclair State.
So when should we expect this book to be out?
It's due in April. I don't think it'll be ready by then, but I'm not the first author to need an extension. But I would say another year and a half it should be published, because publishing is a very long period.
Okay, well, Neil, thank you for coming. I can't wait to read your next book.
Me too. I can't wait to read it either.
And maybe we could have you back on.
Okay.
And we could talk about that book as well.
Okay, thank you so much.
If you would like more information about this episode of Carpe Diem or any other Carpe Diem, you can write to us at the email address on your screen, carpediem@mail.montclair.edu, or call us at 973-655-5158. For Carpe Diem, I'm Krystal Acosta. Thank you for watching.